I first noticed it when Laura started staying late after work. "The girls from the office decided to go out for wine," she said, kissing me on the cheek. This was normal at first, but when wine with the girls started happening 3 times a week, something inside me clicked. One evening she said she was going to a girls' night out, but I saw her leave the house in a black dress that I definitely did not buy for her. I didn't say anything. I just waited. The next morning I found a new dating app on her phone. She didn't even hide it, she just erased the icon from the home screen, but didn't delete the app itself. I didn't want to make a scandal. I decided to do something different. I registered under a false name, downloaded a few photos from the internet and started searching. A week later, Laura swiped me to her right. She didn't know who I was. We started corresponding. I pretended to be a different man, mysterious, confident, funny. She was opening up more than she had ever told me. Laura admitted to this stranger that she had a difficult marriage. I wondered how far she would go. One evening she suggested we meet. "Let's go to that new bar on 5th Street. Friday at 8. I got there an hour before the meeting and took a seat in the far corner. At 7:55, she showed up, wearing the same black dress with a smile that used to be only for me. She sat down at a table, ordered a cocktail, and waited. At 8:10 I got up and went to her table. She looked up, and I saw her smile disappear, turning into something akin to panic. "Hi," I said, sitting down across from him. Laura froze. "What are you doing here?" I think we both know the answer. She looked at me silently for a few seconds, then just exhaled. "Did you know?" "For a long time now." She took her bag and stood up. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, but there was neither shame nor regret in her voice. I nodded and took a white envelope out of my pocket. "Here are the divorce papers." I signed it. Laura silently took the envelope and left the bar without even turning around. I ordered another cocktail and finished it for both of us. The next morning, Laura did not return home. Her hairbrush was still on the sink, our vacation photos were on the dresser, but her clothes were gone from the closet. She left the bar and just disappeared. Part of me was expecting some kind of explosion, tears, accusations, screaming. But Laura took everything she had in silence, as if it were a carefully planned exit. Another part of me realized that this was not her first escape plan. A week later, I met her by chance in a supermarket. She was walking along the milk aisle, holding a basket, as if nothing had happened. I came closer. "Congratulations," I said. Laura didn't even flinch. Nick. We stood for a few seconds in the aisle, among the shelves of food, like ordinary acquaintances. "How are you?" I asked, trying to figure out if something was bothering her. She shrugged her shoulders. "It's okay." Laura put a bottle of orange juice in the basket and looked at me. "You've already signed the documents, right?" "Yeah." "And you?" She nodded. "I will send it today." There was no pity or anger on her face, only indifference. "Well," I said, not knowing how to end this scene. "Bye, Nick," she said simply and went to the cash register. I was left standing by the shelves, holding a can of coffee that I don't even remember picking up. ####. A month after the divorce, Laura's friend wrote to me. "I know you didn't ask, but just FYI, she went to Los Angeles. She says she's starting over." I just smiled. Laura was always looking for something more. New experiences, new people. I became another stage for her that she passed and left behind. But I was not angry. She left, and it was the best thing that could have happened to both of us. Sometimes people disappear from your life as easily as they appear. And that's okay. The main thing is to let them go. After a few months, I realized that I was starting to breathe easier. The house became quieter, and this silence was pleasant. I stopped catching myself thinking that someone would come back late at night or that the phone would ring from an unfamiliar number. One evening I was sitting on the veranda when I saw Theo, my neighbor, who was just getting a divorce. He came out of the house with a bottle of whiskey in his hand and raised it in my direction. "Hey, Nick, let's have some company." I nodded, and a few minutes later I was sitting next to him on the stairs. "How are you holding up?" he asked, filling the glasses. I'm fine. I feel free for the first time in a long time. Chaos my. Divorce has this effect. At first it seems like the end of the world, and then you think, why didn't I do this sooner? We took a sip. Is Laura in Los Angeles yet? He asked. Yeah. She's doing well there. I'm glad she found what she was looking for. Theo twirled the glass thoughtfully in his hands. What about you? What are you looking for, Nick? I thought about it. Probably nothing. I just enjoy what I have. ####. Life went on. 6 months later, Laura wrote again. I just wanted to let you know that I'm moving to New York. I hope you're okay. I didn't answer right away. Then I just wrote it. Thank you. I hope you do too. That was the last thing we said to each other. And I realized that I was no longer waiting for her calls or messages. People come and go. But the most important thing is what stays with you after them. I left with peace in my soul. And that was enough. A year after the divorce, I met Laura by chance. It was a Saturday morning. I went to a local coffee shop to do some work on my laptop. It seemed like nothing special was going to happen until I heard her voice. Nick? I looked up and saw her at the checkout counter. She looked almost exactly the same as the day she left home, surely with the same smile that had once enchanted me. But something in her eyes was different. Laura. Hi. She came to my table with a cup of coffee in her hands. May I? I gestured to an empty chair across the room. Of course. She sat down and spun her cup a little nervously. How are you? Okay. How about you? Does New York suit you? Laura shrugged her shoulders. Yes. But to be honest, I came back. I raised my eyebrows. For good? She nodded. New York was not what I was looking for. It was like her. Laura was always looking for something more, but she never knew what it was. What are you planning now? I don't know. Maybe I'll start all over again. Here at home. I took a sip of coffee and leaned forward a little. Don't you think you've been through this before? She smiled bitterly. Perhaps. But this time it's different. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I don't regret what happened, Nick. But sometimes I wonder how things would have turned out if I had been honest with you from the beginning. I looked at her more closely. I have no regrets. Everything happened the way it was supposed to happen. Laura nodded and then said quietly, if you ever want to have coffee or talk, I'd be happy to. I didn't answer right away. We'll see. She realized what it meant. Laura stood up, paused for a second, and looked at me again. Take care of yourself, Nick. You too, Laura. I watched her leave the coffee shop and realized that for the first time in a long time, I didn't care if we met again. Not because I was angry. It's just that some stories have to end where they end. And it was good. A few weeks passed after our meeting in the coffee shop, and Laura did not write. One evening, on my way home from work, I passed by the park where Laura and I used to walk a lot. It was our place. We used to bring hot chocolate here in the fall, and in the winter we used to make snowmen, laughing like children. Now the park was quiet and empty. I stopped for a second, looking at the old bench where we had sat during our first fight. Little things that once seemed big. When I was about to leave, I saw a familiar figure near the fountain. Laura. She was sitting alone, staring at her phone, as if waiting for someone. I hesitated for a few seconds, then came closer. And how are you doing here, in your new life? She looked up, and her eyes were surprised for a moment, but then Laura just smiled. Nick. I thought I might meet someone here. I sat down next to him with my hands in my jacket pockets. How does it feel to come home after all this? Laura shrugged her shoulders. It's strange. Everything here is familiar, but at the same time it seems different. Maybe because I have changed. I smiled at the edge of my lips. People rarely change for real. And you? Have you changed? I thought about it. Perhaps. But I didn't want to change. Laura was silent for a moment. I think you've become calmer. You've always been like this, I just didn't notice it. I smiled but did not answer. We sat on the bench for another 10 minutes without speaking. It was strange, no tension, no old resentments. When I stood up, Laura looked at me as if she wanted to say something. Are you happy, Nick? I stopped and looked her in the eye. Yeah. And you? She was a little embarrassed. I think I'm still looking for it. I nodded. I hope you do. Laura lowered her head and smiled. Perhaps this time I will stay here for a long time. I didn't say anything. I just walked on, leaving her behind. For the first time, I felt that the past was no longer holding me back. And Laura? Laura remained a part of this past, but she was no longer its center. And that was my final farewell to her. A month after our meeting in the park, I decided to leave the city. It wasn't that I was running away from Laura or the past, but staying in one place seemed wrong. Like I was going in circles. I took a ticket to San Diego, a city I had never been to but always wanted to visit. The sun, the ocean, the feeling of a new beginning. When the plane touched down, I was relieved. Here I could just be myself, without the ghosts of my old life, without meeting the person I once loved on the street. For the first few days, I just walked along the beach, read in coffee shops, and enjoyed the solitude. But fate had its own plans. One morning I decided to go to a small bookstore near the waterfront. It was cozy, smelling of coffee and old pages. I stopped at a rack of detectives when I heard a familiar voice behind me. You're joking. I turned slowly and saw Laura. She was holding the same book as me. We looked at each other for a few seconds, as if trying to understand if this was real. Laura, what are you doing here? She laughed, shaking her head. You'd think I was following you. I'm here on a business trip. I nervously ran my hand through my hair. And of all the cities in the world, you chose this one. San Diego is a good place for a new start. We were standing among the shelves, and I felt the space between us being filled again with those same unspoken words. So, let's have coffee? She suggested, putting the book in the basket. I hesitated, but then he shrugged his shoulders. Why not? ####. We were sitting in a small coffee shop near the store. Laura twirled her spoon in her cup as if trying to find the right words. You know, it's funny, she finally said. We're trying to get away from each other, but for some reason we keep crossing paths. I smiled. Perhaps the universe wants to tell us something. Laura looked up. Maybe it's a sign? I took a sip of coffee, feeling the warmth of the drink spread through my body. I don't know, Laura. Sometimes the signs are just a coincidence, she thought, looking at the ocean through the window. But we are here, and that means something. I did not answer. I just enjoyed this moment. ####. When we left the coffee shop, Laura stopped at her car. Thanks for the company, Nick. I'm always happy to help. She opened the door, but before getting in, she looked at me again. Perhaps we will see each other here again one day. I smiled, shrugging my shoulders. Maybe. Laura drove away, leaving behind only the sound of tires on asphalt. And I stood on the roadside, looking after her, and realized that I was no longer trying to escape. Perhaps we are really destined to cross paths. Or perhaps it was the last time. And any of these options suited me. For the next few days, I hardly thought about Laura. San Diego drew me in with its rhythm. Walks on the beach, morning coffee in small cafes. The ease of being alone without unnecessary explanations and expectations. But the universe seemed to have other plans. On Sunday morning, I decided to go to a park near the hotel. I took a book and coffee with me, found a cozy bench and just enjoyed the silence. Nick? I heard a voice and for a second thought I was imagining it. But when he turned around, he saw Laura again. She was walking down the alley in a tracksuit with headphones in her ears. I laughed and shook my head. Really? Laura raised her hands as if to defend herself. I'm shocked myself. Honestly. She sat down on a bench next to me and took out her headphones. If we continue to cross paths like this, people will think that we are planning it. I put the book on my lap. Do you think it's a sign? Laura thought about it. Before, I would have said it was just a coincidence. But now, we sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the children running around the park and the ocean on the horizon. Maybe this is a chance, she said quietly. I looked at her more closely. A chance for what? Laura smiled nervously and fixed her hair. A chance to just talk. Without pretense. without the past. I looked into her eyes, trying to understand if she was sincere or if she was looking for an escape again. Okay, let's just talk. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. That evening we met on the beach. We sat on the sand, watching the sun slowly disappear behind the horizon. Do you remember how we used to dream of living by the ocean? Laura said, digging her fingers into the wet sand. Yes, but you always said that you would quickly get bored with the same picture. She laughed. I think I've changed, or just tired of running away. Laura looked at me curiously. Do you think I was running away? I'm sure you do. But you know what? So am I. She thought about it, and I saw her eyes soften. Perhaps we were both looking for the wrong thing. The sun has disappeared behind the horizon, leaving behind pink hues in the sky. Laura whispered softly, Is there a chance to start from scratch? I looked at her and thought for a second. It is possible, but let's take it slow. Laura nodded. It sounds good without rushing. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The next morning I woke up to a message. Breakfast at that coffee shop at 9? I smiled and answered, Why not? The coffee shop was almost empty when I walked in. Laura was already sitting at a table by the window, unwrapping a croissant and looking intently at her phone. I approached quietly, but she noticed me before I could even sit down. You're not late. That's weird. I didn't want you to run away earlier. Laura smiled, put down her phone, and looked at me over the top of her cup. I'm not running away anywhere. This time. She nodded, as if recognizing the validity of my words. So, how do you like San Diego? She asked, breaking into a croissant. I like it. Quiet, calm, a different life. What's next? Are you planning to stay here? I was thinking, looking out the window. I don't know yet. I feel good here. Laura looked at me carefully. When are you going back to New York? I asked, changing the subject. I may not return. I raised my eyebrows. Are you serious? She took a bite of the croissant and nodded slowly. New York was a good idea, but I realized that I was just looking for something new. As it turned out, new is not always better. I nodded, thinking the same thing. Do you want to stay here? Maybe. I found a temporary job. I'll see how it goes. We sat in silence for a few minutes. It's strange, I finally said. What exactly? Here we are sitting together again, as if nothing had happened. Laura held her gaze on the cup for a second. Something did happen, but we have grown up. I smiled and took a sip of coffee. Maybe. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. We were leaving the coffee shop together. Laura stopped on the threshold and looked at me. Nick, do you want to go for a walk? I looked at my watch. Why not? We walked along the embankment, and I caught myself thinking that I felt comfortable around her. There was no talking about the past, no explaining things. Do you still surf? Laura suddenly asked. I laughed. The last time it happened was about 10 years ago. We should try again sometime. They say the water here is wonderful. I see you've decided to catch up on all your unfinished business. She smiled slyly. And you don't? I thought about it. Perhaps this is one of them. Laura stopped, took off her sunglasses, and looked at me more seriously than I expected. Do you think we can fix it? I don't know. Do you want to try it? She looked away at the ocean. I think so. No rush? Laura nodded. Take your time. We walked for a long time, not counting the time. That evening I returned home with the feeling that something had moved. Laura didn't write after the walk, and I didn't want to force things either. It felt as if we were both afraid to take an extra step. A few days later, I saw her again by chance, this time in a supermarket. She stood by the wine rack, taking a long time to choose a bottle. White or red? I asked, coming closer. Laura looked up and smiled. I think it's red. The evening calls for something stronger. A special occasion? She took the bottle and twirled it in her hands. It's more like an evening when you want something special. We looked at each other in silence for a few seconds. Do you want some company? I asked unexpectedly for myself. Laura thought for a while and then nodded. Why not? Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. An hour later, we were sitting on her small terrace. Laura lived in a rented house overlooking the ocean, and the evening breeze brought the smell of salt water. She uncorked the wine and filled 2 glasses. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" she asked, handing me the glass. "A little bit, but I don't mind." Laura sat down across from me, tucking her legs under her. "Honestly, I thought we would never talk like this again." "Me neither." We took a few sips, and the silence between us became lighter. "Do you have any regrets, Nick?" I put the glass on the table and thought. "Probably not. Everything that has happened has brought me here." Laura nodded, but her eyes grew serious for a moment. "And I regret it." I looked at her more closely. "Why?" "Because I could have been more honest. And not to waste time running away from what was right there." I didn't know what to say. "But I'm glad we're here," she added quietly. I nodded, watching the sun set over the horizon. "Me neither." ####. That evening was not a breakthrough or a new beginning. But when I left, I had the feeling that something was starting over, only this time from scratch. And it was better than any words. We did not see each other after that evening for almost 2 weeks. Laura didn't write, and I didn't try to get in touch either. It seemed as if we both decided to take our time and let this space exist on its own. But one Saturday, during my morning jog on the beach, I saw her again. She was sitting on the sand, wrapped in a light jacket, looking out at the ocean. Next to her was a book that she obviously hadn't read. I slowed down and came closer. "It's already looking like a habit," I said, stopping next to him. Laura looked up and smiled again. "I thought you would avoid me." "Why?" "Because that's what you always do when you don't know what to say." I sat down next to him on the cold sand and gently rubbed my knees. "And you always disappear when you feel you're getting too close." Laura smiled and nodded. "We know each other well. Until now." She thought for a second and then said, "I thought a lot about that evening." "And what are the conclusions?" Laura raised her hands and shrugged. "No. I was just thinking." We sat in silence, listening to the sound of the waves. "Why did you come back to San Diego, Laura?" I finally asked. She held her breath for a moment, as if she didn't know how to answer. "I don't know. Maybe it's because I feel at home here." I looked at her more closely. "Or because you haven't finished one story here." Laura looked away at the ocean, as if trying to hide from my words. "Maybe." She picked up the book from the sand and shook out a few grains of sand. "Do you know what's strange?" "What?" "I didn't think we would ever be able to talk like this. After everything." I smiled. Time does strange things to people. Or heals. We sat in silence for a while longer, and then Laura spoke. "Breakfast?" I nodded, getting up. "Why not?" And we walked along the beach as if it were a normal thing. We found a small cafe overlooking the ocean. Laura chose a table on the terrace, and we sat down, watching the waves roll in. "I haven't been here before," I said, opening the menu. Laura nodded as if it were her secret place. "I come here when I want to think." "What are you thinking about?" She looked up, paused for a second, and then smiled. "About how life always brings you back to where you should be." I said nothing, realizing that she was talking about more than just this cafe. We ordered. I had an omelet with cheese, Laura had avocado toast. "How's work?" I asked to change the subject. "Not bad. I found a small project." "I like to keep busy," she said, stroking her coffee cup with her fingers. "What's next?" Laura shrugged her shoulders. "I'm not making any predictions. I may stay here longer." "Do you really like it here? Or is it just a convenient stopover?" She paused, as if considering my question. "Probably both." I took a sip of coffee and looked at her more closely. "Do you have a feeling that you are looking for something specific?" Laura ran her spoon thoughtfully along the edge of the cup. "I used to think I was looking for new experiences. And now, I think I'm just looking for a place where I can be myself." "And this place is San Diego?" "Maybe. It's easier to breathe here." We ate in silence for a few minutes. "You know," she said, setting down her plate, "I'm surprised how easily we're talking again. Did you expect otherwise?" Laura laughed. "Yes. I thought we would avoid difficult topics. We are just older. It used to seem more important." Maybe. She looked at me as if trying to understand whether I really thought so. What's next, Nick? I raised my eyebrows. What do you mean? Are we just going to randomly cross paths in the city and pretend it's fate? I smiled. Do you want it differently? Laura carefully placed the spoon on the plate. I don't know, but I don't want to run away anymore. We left this question up in the air again. And it was normal. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. After breakfast, we took a walk along the coast. When we reached the intersection where our paths usually diverged, Laura stopped. You know what? What? She thought for a second, then nodded toward the waterfront. Let's go a little further. I smiled and followed her. We walked in silence along the embankment, and I could feel Laura glancing at me from time to time, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. It's always been difficult for you to stay silent for so long, I said, unable to stand it. Laura stopped and laughed, elbowing me lightly. I try not to spoil the moment. It's a strange thing. People change, Nick. We came to a bench overlooking the ocean and stopped. Laura sat down cross-legged and stared into the distance. I sat down next to her with my hands in my pockets. I used to come here a lot after we broke up, she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the water. When everything was piling up, I would just sit here for hours. I didn't know, and I wasn't supposed to know. It was my place where I tried to understand what I had done wrong. I lowered my head, looking at my sneakers. Do you think it was a mistake? Laura turned to me.
No.
I think it was inevitable. She breathed in the sea air and closed her eyes. But I wasn't ready to accept it at the time. I watched the sun reflecting in her hair and realized that for the first time in a long time I felt calm next to her. No resentment, no burden of the past. What are you looking for now, Laura? She slowly opened her eyes and leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. Nothing. For the first time in a long time, I just want to be where I am. And this is San Diego? And this is San Diego, she smiled. We sat on the bench for a while longer, listening to the cries of seagulls and watching surfers catch waves. Do you remember when we wanted to buy a house by the ocean? She suddenly asked. I remember that, but back then we barely had enough money for rent. Laura laughed. And now? And now I'm not sure I want to be tied to one place. She nodded, and I felt her eyes slide over me. Neither do I. But someday maybe. Laura stood up, shook the sand out of her pants, and held out her hand to me. Let's go. I feel like we've been here long enough. I took her hand and got up. What's next? Laura looked at me with a slight smile. No rush, remember? I remember. We walked along the shore, and this time the silence was not awkward. It was exactly what we both needed. The next morning I found a note under the door. Breakfast is at 9 o'clock. You know where?
Él.
I smiled, even though I didn't exactly remember that we had agreed on breakfast. But I didn't want to refuse. She was already waiting at the cafe, this time sitting at the same table by the window. Am I the first again? I said, sitting down across from him. Laura put the phone down and smiled slyly. I thought I'd be here earlier, but you beat me to it. I took a sip of the coffee the waiter placed in front of me. And what is this mysterious note? Laura propped her chin on her hand and looked at me. I decided it was time to change the rules. What kind of rules? She shrugged her shoulders. Instead of waiting for chance meetings in the supermarket or on the beach, I just call you for breakfast. That's pretty bold. Laura smiled, as if she liked that I was a little puzzled. Everything changes one day, Nick. Even me. I wanted to say something sarcastic, but at that moment the waiter brought our orders. Breakfast was held in a light atmosphere. Laura talked about her new project, which seemed to be working with a small gallery. Are you still working remotely? She asked, finishing her toast. Yes. For now, it's fine. Laura leaned back, watching me. Everything looks so stable for you. And you don't? For the first time in a long time, yes. I couldn't shake the feeling that Laura was behaving differently. Before, she was always the one who disappeared when she got too close. But now she was sitting in front of me, as if she was really trying to stay here. Listen, Laura began after a short pause. I have a suggestion. Yes, sir. We went to Los Angeles for the weekend. Just to go for a walk like we used to. I raised my eyebrows. Are you serious? Why not? We don't have any plans anyway. I thought about it. The idea seemed unexpected, but somehow interesting. Okay, but I'm driving. Laura laughed. No problem. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The next morning we left for Los Angeles. The road was easy, we listened to music, recalled old stories. It was like one of those trips we used to take when we first started dating. But as it turned out, Los Angeles brought more than I expected. In the evening, when we were walking along the Santa Monica waterfront, Laura stopped and looked at me. There is one more thing I have not mentioned. I was wary. And what is it? Laura took a deep breath. I applied for a job here. If everything goes well, I will move here. I froze for a second, digesting her words. So you're going to leave again? I'm not sure if I'll get the job, but I wanted you to know. I looked at her, feeling a strange mixture of emotions, from surprise to some slight disappointment. And you decided to run away again? No, this time not to escape. Just try something new. Laura was waiting for my reaction, but I didn't know what to say. If you move, will it change anything for us? She was silent for a while and then answered, I don't know, but I don't want to run away from what's important anymore. We were standing on the beach, watching the sun set over the horizon. It didn't feel like the end, but I could not call it a beginning either. The next morning we were having coffee on the terrace of a small hotel on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Laura was sitting across from me, wrapped in a light blanket, looking out over the city, which was already starting to wake up. I haven't decided yet whether I really want to stay here, she said, as if continuing yesterday's conversation. I turned to her, twirling the spoon in the cup. But you applied anyway. Laura smiled a little. Yes, I wanted to leave myself a choice. I could feel a familiar feeling growing inside me, the same feeling that arose every time she talked about change. If you get accepted, will you tell me right away, or will you just leave as usual? She raised her head and looked me straight in the eye. Nick, I've changed. Maybe. But every time I start to believe it, you disappear. Laura looked down at her cup and said quietly, That's why I brought you here. I don't want to do it again. We sat in silence for a few seconds. If you stay in Los Angeles, I'm not sure I want to go through that again. Laura raised her eyebrows. I'm not asking for it. But you want me to stay close to you. She pressed her lips together as if trying to find the right words. I want you to decide for yourself. I thought about it. Laura, we've been here before. Moves, escapes, new starts. But each time it ended in the same way. She nodded, listening intently. So this time I'm not going to stop you. If you need to do it, do it. But I will stay here in San Diego. Laura looked at me for a long time and then said quietly, I knew you would say that. Because you know me well. She smiled, but it was a smile with a slight tinge of sadness. And you me too. We finished our coffee and went to pack our things. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The trip back was almost as quiet as the trip here. Only occasionally did Laura turn on the music and hum to herself. When we got back to San Diego, she pulled up outside my house and turned off the engine. Thank you for the ride, she said, keeping her hands on the wheel. It was not bad, I answered. Laura leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. See you, Nick. I got out of the car and stood there while it drove away. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. A week passed. Laura did not write or call. And then one evening I received a message. We got it. I'm moving in a month. But I don't want it to be goodbye. I looked at the phone screen for a long time before answering. Then let it be just a pause. And I really thought so, because sometimes people come back, and sometimes they don't, and I agreed with both options. A month has passed. Laura moved to Los Angeles. Her last phrase about goodbye hung somewhere between us like an unfinished story. I've seen her Instagram stories, her new office, sunrises overlooking the Hollywood Hills, random photos from walks on Venice Beach. She didn't write to me directly, and I didn't want to talk to her either. But one evening I went for a walk on the waterfront. San Diego was bathed in the golden light of the sunset, and I thought I was happy here. Then the phone rang. Laura. I stopped for a second, looking at her name on the screen. Hello? I said, picking up the phone. How are you? I'm good. And you? Not bad either. I was thinking, I'll come down for the weekend. San Diego. I was surprised, but I didn't show it in my voice. Have you decided to escape from the big city? Laura laughed. Something like that. I want to spend some time by the ocean. And where will you stay? She was silent for a moment. If you don't mind, at your place. I heard a slight note of uncertainty in her voice. I'm not against it. Okay. Then I'll see you on Friday. I'm waiting. ####. Friday. When I opened the door, Laura was standing on the threshold with a small suitcase. It's like I'm coming back from a business trip again, she joked. Come. She entered the apartment, looking around as if trying to find something new. But everything was the same as it had been. Nothing has changed, she said, putting her suitcase down by the couch. This is San Diego. Things are slow here. Laura nodded. That's probably why I keep coming back here. I cooked dinner and we ate on the balcony, listening to the waves. How was Los Angeles? I asked when she put down her wine glass. Let me put it this way. It's good, but not like this. Do you regret leaving? Laura looked at me as if she was weighing something in her head. No, but I regret leaving you. I put down my glass and met her gaze. You decided to leave on your own. I know, and yet it still feels strange. We were silent for a few seconds, listening to the wind sway the curtains. Are you staying long this time? I asked. Laura smiled. We'll see. These words sounded like something more than just an answer, and this time I did not object. The next morning I woke up to the smell of coffee. Laura stood in the kitchen, rolling up the sleeves of my shirt, which she had taken from the closet, and was concentrating on pouring coffee into 2 cups. Did you sleep well? She asked without even turning around. Yes, but I don't remember letting you go through my things. Laura smiled and put the cup in front of me. It was extremely necessary. I sat down at the table, watching her take a bite of toast and flip through her phone. Anything interesting in the news? It's nothing new. As usual, everyone is running away, someone is looking for someone. I raised my eyebrows. It's ironic. Laura looked at me over the top of her cup. Maybe. We ate breakfast in silence for a few minutes. Laura felt as if she had always been here, as if her absence had been a brief episode rather than a nearly year-long pause. What do you plan to do today? I asked. I was thinking of walking around the old neighborhood. Do you remember our first apartment? I laughed. It's hard to forget the place where we argued about how to arrange the sofa. Because you wanted to put it in the middle of the room, she said, glancing at me. And it was brilliant. Laura shook her head, but there was a warm gleam in her eyes. Will you walk with me? I thought for a second, then nodded. Why not? ####. Our old apartment looked almost exactly the same as it did a few years ago. The same blue door, the same tiny windows that faced the street with palm trees. Laura stopped at the entrance, leaning against the railing. Do you remember how we almost froze to death here one winter because of a broken heater? I remember. We slept under 3 blankets and made a kettle every 15 minutes. Laura laughed. It was like an adventure. I looked at her. Why did you bring me here? She thought for a second and then shrugged. I just wanted to remind you that we were happy. And then you left. Laura did not look away. And now I'm here. I sighed and sat down on the rail next to her. What do you expect, Laura? She was silent for a few seconds. I don't know. Maybe you'll start trusting me again. I looked at her hands, which she held carefully in her lap. I did not stop. But I don't know if it's good. Laura nodded. Give me some time. How much? As much as you need. We were sitting next to each other, watching people with dogs and children walk down the street. This morning felt light, but I knew it was only the beginning, or a new round of what we have not yet completed. We sat in silence as the sun slowly rose higher above the palm trees. Laura looked at the door of our old apartment as if she was trying to bring back something from the past. Do you remember how we once argued over the choice of color for the walls? She suddenly said, smiling slightly. Of course. You wanted warm beige and I insisted on navy blue. In the end, we left everything white. We just gave up. I laughed. Laura leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, and looked thoughtfully at the sidewalk. Perhaps this was our problem. I returned to her. What do you mean? She thought for a moment, as if searching for words. We often gave up. When we had to fight or at least try, we just retreated. I looked down, feeling her words touch something deep inside. You may be right, but this time I don't want to give up. I looked her straight in the eye. Laura, we are not the same people we were then. And that's good, she answered without pause. This confidence in her voice was unusual. She no longer looked like someone who was running away. I felt that part of me wanted to believe her. The other part was still keeping its distance. Will this be enough time for you? I finally asked. Laura nodded. I am in no hurry. We sat for a while longer, watching the life around us, as if nothing important was happening. Do you want to go inside? I suggested when the silence dragged on. Laura smiled but shook her head.
No.
Let it remain as it is. She stood up and walked along the sidewalk, lightly touching the old railing as if to check if it was still holding. Do you want to ride back? I asked, getting up. Let's go for a walk instead. All the way to the shore? Laura nodded. Why not? We have plenty of time. I stood next to her. What's next? Laura looked at me with the same light smile that had once enchanted me. We'll see what happens next. We started walking toward the ocean, and this time I walked beside her without any expectations. We walked in silence, listening to the noise of the city, which gradually changed to the sound of waves rolling onto the shore. When we got to the beach, Laura took off her sneakers and walked barefoot in the sand. I remained standing a little to the side, watching her dip her toes in the water as if to check if she was really there. Do you remember when we spent the night here? She asked, not turning to me. I smiled slightly. How could I forget? We forgot the keys to the apartment and decided not to wake the owner. Laura laughed softly, raising her face to the sun. It was one of the best evenings. I came closer, but left a few steps between us. Yes, until we froze and woke up to the sound of the surf. But then you covered me with your sweater, because you complained every 10 minutes. Laura turned to me, her eyes sparkling slyly. And you liked it. I didn't answer anything. She came closer, holding her sneakers in her hands, and stopped next to me. What are you afraid of, Nick? I thought for a second, looking at the horizon line. Perhaps that we will go back to where we came from. Laura looked at me carefully. And if not, what if it is? She sighed and fell silent for a moment. Listen, I'm not asking you for a second chance or for everything to be like before. I want to be there for you. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to put my thoughts together. What if I don't know how to do it? Laura pressed her lips together, but there was no resentment in her eyes. Then we will start from the beginning. No obligations, no past. Just like two people who feel good together. We were standing at the very edge of the water, and I could feel the waves washing away the traces of our steps. Okay, I finally said. Laura nodded, and we walked along the shore, letting the ocean take away all the unspoken words. This time, none of us were in a hurry. We walked along the shore for almost an hour. Laura would stop from time to time, bend down and pick up smooth stones, which she would then throw into the water, watching them dissolve in the waves. You always did, I said as she bent down once again, looking for another stone. It's soothing, she replied, not taking her eyes off the ocean. By the way, you taught me how to throw them properly. I remember. At first, you just threw them into the water without any plan. Laura smiled. You always do everything according to plan, don't you? It's in my blood. She raised her head, looked at me, but said nothing. When we got to the old pier, Laura sat down on one of the wooden benches and gestured for me to sit next to her. You know, I think about this place more than I'd like, she said, looking at the horizon. San Diego?
No.
This is the beach. Why? She turned the stone thoughtfully in her hands. Because here we have always been honest. Do you remember how many times we sat here and just talked? I nodded. It's easier here. The ocean seems to take away everything unnecessary. Laura pursed her lips for a second. Nick, I want to ask you something, but I'm afraid of the answer. I returned to her. Ask. She was silent for a few seconds, as if deciding whether to continue. Have you ever thought that we could be together again? I looked at the waves rolling onto the shore. I thought about it. But every time this thought came, I remembered how it all ended. Laura nodded, as if she had expected this answer. I thought about it too. And every time I realized that I didn't want to repeat the same mistakes. We were sitting on a bench, and it seemed to me that time seemed to have stopped. Maybe we can stay just friends, she said quietly. Maybe, I answered, not knowing if it was true. Laura stood up, shook the sand off her jeans, and held out her hand to me. Let's go. I know a place with good seafood. I took her hand and got up. No rush, right? Yes, she smiled. Take your time. And we left, letting the ocean erase another page of our history. We found a small restaurant on the edge of the beach, one of those that looks too modest, but the locals always recommend it. Laura chose a table by the window overlooking the sunset. It's strange that I've never been here, she said, looking at the menu. You've always been more drawn to city centers, to bright signs. Laura nodded. And you, to silence. Perhaps that's why we fought so often. I smiled as I closed the menu. Perhaps. But now you are sitting here in a quiet place. She put down the menu and propped her chin on her hand, looking at me. Because I am learning. Why? Being close to people who matter. I was slightly surprised by these words. Laura rarely spoke so directly. And how are you doing? You're still here, aren't you? The waiter brought oysters and 2 glasses of white wine. Laura raised her glass. Let's drink to that. Why exactly? For the fact that we both haven't given up yet. After we drank, Laura looked at the ocean outside the window for a long time. Remember how we used to come here at night just to watch the waves? Of course. We then bought hot chocolate and froze in 10 minutes. She laughed, her eyes shining. But it was one of the best evenings. I felt the memories wash over me in a wave. We were younger, more carefree, and it seemed like the world belonged to us. Laura, why are you here now? She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. Because I want to know if there is still a chance. I thought about it, carefully placing the glass on the table. And what if they don't? Then I'll just spend some time with the person I care about. Her words made me feel warmer. Okay, I said. Then let's just be here now. It's a deal, Laura replied, raising her glass again. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, and I felt that we were really in no hurry. And this time it was right. The next morning Laura was still sleeping when I went out to the balcony with a cup of coffee. The ocean was calm. The waves barely touched the shore. The city was slowly waking up, and I tried to capture the moment of this silence. Laura came out half an hour later, wrapped in my gray sweatshirt. She sat down next to me in silence, tucking her legs under her. Do you have any coffee? She asked, yawning. In the kitchen. You could have brought me one, she said with a smile. You're wearing my sweater. I think that's fair. Laura laughed and disappeared for a few minutes. When she returned with a cup in her hand, she sat on the edge of the balcony and looked at me. I thought about what you said yesterday. I raised my eyebrows. What is it about? About the chance. I waited for her to take a sip of coffee, as if to collect her thoughts. I won't insist if you don't want to start anything again. But, Laura sighed. I just like being around you. And to be honest, it's scary. I put the cup on the table. Why? Because I'm afraid I'll do something wrong. Again. I stared at her for a long time, trying to figure out if this was the same Laura who had once so easily left my life. Maybe this time it will be different, I finally said. Laura smiled and ran her hand through her hair. It can. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, just listening to the sound of the waves. I have an idea, Laura said, suddenly jumping to her feet. What else? We're going to the mountains today. We've been wanting to do this for a long time. Remember? Really? Really? Why not? I thought for a second, then shrugged. Okay, but you're driving. Laura laughed. Oh, this is going to be fun. And we hit the road again. This time I felt that I had no expectations. And there was something right about that. We went to the mountains the same day. Laura was driving, and for the first time in a long time, I was just sitting next to her, enjoying the ride. She was singing along to the music, occasionally glancing at me with that slight smile I remembered from our first trips. We went up to an observation deck that overlooked the entirety of San Diego and stopped the car. I didn't think we'd actually make it, Laura said as she turned off the engine. What was stopping you? She got out of the car and leaned on the hood. I guess I was just afraid that you wouldn't want to come with me. I stood next to him, and we watched the sun disappear over the horizon together. I am here. Laura turned to me, her hair blowing in the wind. I'm glad you're here, Nick. She looked me straight in the eye, as if she was waiting for me to take the next step. I did. We kissed each other. It was quiet, simple, and somehow natural, as if we had been waiting for this moment for a long time, but we were both afraid to spoil it with words. When Laura pulled away, a slight smile remained on her lips. Does this mean we're back together? I put my arms around her shoulders, drawing in the cool mountain air. I think so. Laura leaned her head on my shoulder, and we stood there, looking at the city below. I don't want to run away this time, she said quietly. I know. She squeezed my hand as if she was afraid I would disappear. And you won't disappear? No. Laura raised her head and looked me in the eye. Well then, you're invited to dinner tonight. I'm making pasta. Wow. I thought we were celebrating more seriously. She laughed. Well, pasta is also serious. Okay, I believe you. We got in the car and drove back to the city, and I realized that everything had fallen into place. Finally, the evening was simple but special. Laura did make pasta simple but delicious. We had dinner on her terrace, listening to the distant sounds of the ocean and the city at night. I sat sipping wine, and Laura sat next to me, putting her legs under her and covering herself with a thin blanket. Do you remember how we used to do this all the time? She asked, looking at me over the edge of her glass. It was probably the best thing we had. Yes, the easiest way. She leaned forward and carefully placed the glass on the table. Nick, I want to ask you something. Yes, sir. Laura hesitated a bit, choosing her words carefully. Let's not put things off any longer. If we want to do something, we do it. If we need to say something, we say it right away. I looked at her, feeling her words touch something important inside. Good, I replied simply. Laura smiled and put her head down on my shoulder. Nick, I've never told you this directly, but you've always been more to me than I've ever recognized. I ran my hand through her hair, inhaling the light scent of the sea air mixed with the smell of her shampoo. I know. We sat there for some time. I have an idea, she suddenly said, standing up. Another trip? Laura squinted slyly. No. Just stay here tonight. I raised my eyebrows. Are you sure? For the first time in a long time, yes. I looked into her eyes, trying to understand what was behind those words. But Laura was as honest as ever. Good. She stood up and held out her hand to me. Let's go. And I followed her, knowing that this time we would not lose what we had just begun to regain. The morning started with Laura waking me up with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I opened my eyes and saw her in the doorway with 2 cups. She looked relaxed and even a little happy. Coffee in bed? Are you sure you're Laura? I asked, sitting up and pulling the blanket to my chest. Very funny, Nick, she replied, setting her cup down on the nightstand next to her. I just thought I'd start the morning with something nice. Who are you and what have you done with my ex-girlfriend? She laughed as she sat down next to me and gently sipped her coffee. Listen, I was thinking about us last night. Oh no, that never ends well. Very funny, Laura laughed again. I'm serious. I looked at her more closely. Okay, what were you thinking? Laura hesitated a bit, carefully placing the cup on the nightstand. I don't want us to repeat the same mistakes. I don't want to get stuck in the past again. Are you talking about our past? Yes. We always discuss what went wrong, but we never focus on what is now. I thought, looking at the coffee in my cup. And what do you propose? Laura turned to me, her eyes serious and warm at the same time. Let's live in the moment. No comparisons, no constant analysis, no expectations. Let's just be. I looked at her carefully. How do you imagine this? She shrugged her shoulders. It's just like normal life. We wake up, make coffee, laugh when we feel like it, and keep quiet when we don't feel like talking. I was silent for a long time, thinking about her words. It can work. Maybe, she agreed. If we both want it. I put the cup on the nightstand and turned to her. Okay, I'll do it. Laura smiled and ran her finger along the edge of my palm. Then let's get started right now. And so we started. Without complicated promises and unnecessary words. We just took what we had at that moment and decided not to lose it again. That day passed as if we had both finally learned to breathe in a new way. We didn't plan anything special. Laura suggested we go to the market and buy something for dinner. Pasta? She asked as we passed a tomato stand. Why not? But do you remember that last time your pasta was a little, experimental? It was a new recipe. Laura was outraged, but there was a smile in her eyes. I reached out and took a tomato from her basket and tossed it in my hand. Let's stick with the classic. Okay, she nodded, elbowing me lightly. But I can't promise that I won't add something of my own. We returned home with the full bags and Laura took over the kitchen. I sat on a bar stool, watching her chop vegetables, and caught myself thinking that for the first time in a long time I felt completely at ease. What is it? She asked, noticing my look. Nothing. I'm just watching. Are you watching me chop onions? That's very romantic, Nick. I laughed. Hey, there's something special about that. Laura shook her head, but the smile did not leave her face. When the pasta was ready, we had dinner on the balcony, listening to the ocean again. I could stay here, she said quietly when we finished eating. What do you mean? Laura put down her fork and looked at me. I mean, I'm happy here with you, and I don't want to go back to Los Angeles. I put the glass down and leaned toward her. Laura, are you sure? She nodded. Yeah. I don't want to lose this feeling. We sat in silence, and I realized that this decision came easily to her because she no longer had any doubts. And I had no doubts either. Then stay, I said simply. Laura smiled and took my hand. And so it was agreed. It was not a big gesture or an official decision. It was just a moment that marked the beginning of something new. And this time we were both ready to stay. The next few days passed in a strange calm. Laura left a few of her things in the bathroom and a couple of sweaters in my closet. She didn't say anything out loud, but I could tell she was gradually settling in. On Sunday, she brought home a new blanket and hung a garland with small lanterns on the balcony. It's for the atmosphere, she said, as if making an excuse. I didn't say anything, just raised an eyebrow. What? Laura smiled. You said we needed more heat. I was talking about blankets, not garlands. It still looks good. And she was right. Those evenings when we sat on the balcony with wine, wrapped in the same new blanket, seemed the easiest and best in a long time. ####. One evening we were sitting by the window drinking tea when Laura suddenly said, I think I'm going to go to Los Angeles for a few days. I was a little surprised, but I didn't show it. Have you decided to pick up your things? Yes. And close some cases. I need to put everything in its place. I nodded, although I felt a little uneasy. You will come back, right? Laura put the cup down and touched my hand. Yes, Nick. I'm not running away. Her voice was calm, and this time I believed her. Good. Will you come with me? I thought for a second, but then shook my head. I think I'll stay here. Someone should have some warm pasta when you get back. Laura smiled and gently squeezed my hand. Then I'll be quick. ####. The next morning I helped her pack her suitcase. Laura was fussing around, looking for some small things she might need. It's only for a few days, I reminded her, watching her throw another book into her bag. I know. It's just that I don't like to return to old places. Then do it quickly. She stopped and looked at me. This is exactly what I planned to do. As I was walking her to the car, Laura paused at the door and turned to me. You won't change your mind while I'm gone, will you? I laughed. I am here, and I will wait. Laura came closer and kissed me softly. I'll be back on Friday. Don't forget the pasta. It's a deal. She got into the car, and I stood there watching her drive out of the yard. It felt strange, like the end of one story and the beginning of another. And I knew that when she came back, everything would be back to normal. Laura returned late on Friday night. I heard the familiar sound of her car pulling up outside the house. Opening the door, I saw her on the threshold with the same suitcase, but with a different expression on her face. She looked tired but happy. You're late. I thought you changed your mind, I said, leaning on the doorframe. Laura shrugged her shoulders and entered, leaving her suitcase at the entrance. I was just delayed on the road. But I'm here. I closed the door and handed her a glass of wine that was already waiting on the kitchen table. Have you closed everything? Yes. I gave the keys back, packed my things. Los Angeles doesn't feel like my place anymore. We stood in the kitchen, sipping wine. Laura looked as calm as she had promised. Do you have anything for dinner? She asked, looking into the pots. Just as you asked, pasta. Laura laughed, leaning slightly toward me. I knew you would take it seriously. I put the plates on the table, and we had dinner the same way we did a few days ago, on the balcony under the same lanterns she had hung. Laura sat next to me, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the ocean. How strange, isn't it? She said, leaning toward me. What exactly? That we are here again, together. I looked at her and gently ran my fingers over her hand. Strange. But it's right. Laura leaned her head slightly on my shoulder, and I felt her breathing steady. You know, I thought that when I came back, something would be wrong. But now I realize that this is everything I wanted. To be here, to be with you. I didn't say anything,